Love is like a blessing from the King's only love can bring the healing from the Queen's. Love is like a blessing from the King's only love can bring the healing from the Queen.
In this Black Mestory series, we take an in-depth look at the region of West Africa, defined in a broad context as being as far north as Mauritania and as far east as Chad, with the Central African Republic on the southeast curving into Cameroon. The fourth part in our series on West Africa looks at what was happening across the whole of the region between 1500 and 1800 CE, following on from what we covered in part 3 of this series when we looked at West Africa between 1000 and 1500. As we discussed in part 3 of this series, the most notable occurrence in West Africa throughout the first half of the second millennium was the emergence of the Islamic faith, which had taken hold across most of the northern 2/3 of the whole region during this period. Whilst right at the end of the 15th century, the Portuguese arrived, beginning their trading activity, including the purchase of slaves, around the West African coastline at various locations from Mauritania through to Cameroon. Midway through the 16th century would see the arrival of Mane warriors, a non-Muslim sect of Mandinko people from the defunct Mali Empire based in the modern-day Ivory Coast, who had migrated west into Liberia before moving north along the so-called Pepper coastline to reach Sierra Leone with the intention of establishing a strong trading state modelled on the old Ghana and Mali empires. Both of these entities had benefited through their trading connections to the camel caravans operating on the Saharan trade routes, and it was expected that the Mane would be able to enrich themselves by exploiting the salt resources there. Their strategy for building a strong nation was to absorb all whom they came across into their grouping, using the propaganda of a cannibalistic culture to strike fear into the hearts of any opposition that they might meet, enabling them to successfully cause their enemies to submit with little, if any, resistance. As Walter Rodney wrote when referring to the Mane in his book, A History of Upper Guinea, 1545 to 1800, published in 1970, the forces which they drafted into their army were said to be eaters of human flesh. These troops were known by the name Sumba, identifying them exactly in this context. Rodney goes on to write the following: the reputation of the Sumbas, enhanced by rumour, was enough to spread terror and a disinclination to resist. Their contact with the Portuguese at their off-coast locations was minimal, a situation promoted by the Africans and mulattoes who had a monopoly over the business being done in the coastal regions. As Walter Rodney points out in the same book, the inhabitants on the seafront used every means of propaganda to keep the inland people away from the Europeans, which would include advising them to avoid contact with the Europeans as Walter Rodney writes, there was always a danger of being carried off in slave ships if they turned up to sell their commodities. By 1600, European activity around the West African coast had increased significantly. At Mauritania, French traders had arrived for the purpose of purchasing gum, whilst further south in Senegal, several European nations squabbled over control of the transatlantic slave traffic coming out of the region. The Dutch briefly set up a trading post at Liberia before going on to hold a significant presence further south in Angola and South Africa within the following 50 years. The Europeans' appearance at the Ivory Coast saw the start of their exploitation of ivory in the region, bringing a sharp decline in the elephant population located there. At the location of the present-day Benin, the Kingdom of Dahomey was established for the purpose of doing trade with the Europeans on the coast to meet their demand for slave stock to transport across the Atlantic Ocean, quickly becoming, in the view of the Europeans, a reliable source for quality product. The Mandara Kingdom, based at the mountains of northern Cameroon, were at risk of experiencing slave raids to service both the Arabs and European slave markets, and in response to this grave possibility, negotiated with the Bonu Empire to gain their protection. By this time, Mauritania had become an Islamic-ruled state, as the Almoravids, or Moors, of Morocco moved south to make war with the Songhai Empire in Mali, successfully taking possession of territory connected to the nearby Saharan trade route. Early in the 17th century, infighting within the Mandara Kingdom over the opposing claims to the throne saw the Bonu Empire step in on behalf of the king to preserve his position of authority in the territory. By doing so, the Emperor of Bonu was able to assert some influence over the Mandara Kingdom. The Bonu Empire's sphere of influence would also spread during this period to cover the Kotoko Kingdom, also in northern Cameroon. European presence around the West African coast continued to grow, and by 1650 there were over 30 European-controlled forts on the coast of present-day Ghana. The Ashanti Confederation was formed in relation to this to meet the increased demand for gold, ivory and slaves. A decade later, the British had set up a trading post at Liberia for the purpose of obtaining more slave stock for their colonies in the Caribbean and North America, and by the end of the century they had become the major player in the shipping of Africans for the transatlantic slave trade from Sierra Leone and other accessible West African locations. At Ghana, the trade in slaves had overtaken the trade in gold and ivory in this region. In Central African Republic, slave raids had begun, this time with the kidnapped victims being transported towards the west coast to service the Europeans' desire to purchase slaves for exploitation on the plantations of the Americas. In northern Ivory Coast, the Kong Empire was established with the somewhat old-fashioned intention of linking into the trade on the Saharan trade routes. Just a couple of decades into the 18th century, the king of the Mandara people in the northern mountains of Cameroon converted to the Islamic faith, very much influenced by the fact that his kingdom was a vassal state operating under the protection and watchful eye of the already Islamized Bonu Empire, who they relied on for protection against hostile intrusions into their territory. The success that the Kingdom of Dahomey had been having in building its strength through its slave trading activity with the Europeans on the coast of modern-day Benin had drawn the attention of the powerful Oyo Empire, a branch of the Yoruba people located in the neighboring territory of modern-day Nigeria. They would make war with the Dahomey around 1730, managing to overpower them by sheer force of numbers against the firearms that the Dahomey Kingdom had acquired from the European traders. By the middle of the 18th century, there was a very notable level of friction within the southern portion of the West African region, obviously tied to high levels of slave raiding related activity. From the Ivory Coast, where a further grouping of Akan migrants relocated to, after pressure from their own comrades in the Ashanti Confederacy, to present-day Nigeria, where infighting amongst the various clans within the Yoruba and Unri communities occurred for the purpose of making economical gains through the capture of prisoners to be sold on to the European traders on the coast. Olude Equiano, who had lived as a child in Nigeria during this time before his capture into slavery, wrote on this subject in his book published in 1789. Such a mode of obtaining slaves in Africa is common, and I believe more procured this way and by kidnapping than any other. The Oro Confederacy, a grouping of Africans in eastern Nigeria with strong connections to the Unri Igbo people, was formed through the cooperation of neighbouring small states and villages wishing to benefit from the trade in the export of palm oil and slaves to the Europeans. Their rapid growth would see them expand into Western Cameroon during this same period. Going through towards the end of the century, Britain negotiated possession of some territory on the coast of present-day Sierra Leone, where they could repatriate a significant number of London's Black poor, who were made up of former slaves granted their freedom by virtue of having set foot on British soil. The British would name this patch of coastal territory the Province of Freedom. Olude Equiano, who by then had gained his freedom from slavery and had begun campaigning in England for the abolition of the slave trade, would have been an influence in Britain making this decision, having the ear of several important MPs of the day. Further transportation of blacks into this region would take place a decade later, around 1800, when African Americans who sided with the British during the American War of Independence were taken there to make a new life for themselves. Jamaican Maroons who had been exiled to Nova Scotia in Canada because of their rebellious actions on the island were also given the right by the British to relocate to this destination. Britain and France had been squabbling over control of territory on the West African coast around the location of Senegal during this period of time. They would finally come to an agreement whereby France would have Senegal, whilst Britain would have control over the River Gambia, which runs through the middle of that territory. This agreement would see British explorer Mungo Park able to venture inland, upstream along the river, and continue eastward into Mali to become the first white European to reach the River Niger. He wrote a book relating his experiences while undertaking this expedition, published in 1799, called Travels in the Interior Districts of Africa. His success may have been helped by the fact that the people of present-day Mali and Niger were at this time somewhat distracted by the war situation that was happening with the Moroccans, who had been controlling territory close to the Saharan trade routes and were now being successfully driven out. The Fulani were a semi-nomadic warrior nation said to have ancestral roots going back to the first nomads of West Africa, who had migrated over 2,000 years before down into Senegal from Mauritania. Their gradual spread across the West African region would see Fulani settlements marking out a trail that would take them through Burkina Faso and into Nigeria. By 1800, they would invade into northern Cameroon, coinciding with a general decline in power and influence of the Borno Empire from its base in Chad. This period between 1500 and 1800 is marked by the establishment of the transatlantic slave trade, with Britain becoming a significant player in the transport of kidnapped Africans across the ocean. An industry that would grow due to the Africans' own eagerness to engage in the business of selling their own people to the Europeans on the coast to be shipped away never to be seen again. This situation had the effect of sparking many battles and wars amongst the neighbouring tribal nations and village states of the southern part of the West African region, and causing great movements of whole populations of people. By the end of the 18th century, both France and Britain had managed to negotiate control of territories on the windward-facing West African coast at Senegal and Sierra Leone respectively. Both European powers were perhaps sensing the coming to an end of the slave era, with France having to deal with the fallout from the Haitian Revolution and Britain using their territory to relocate former slaves from America and the Caribbean.
Love is like a blessing from the King's only love can bring the healing from the Queen's love is like a blessing from the King's only love can bring the healing from the Queen.